Thank you for gathering here for an event featuring Reverend Allan Boesak. He will be drawing from his experience in the struggle in South Africa to speak of another struggle of Palestinians for freedom, justice, and their human rights and dignity. Contending Modernities, a global research initiative focusing on religion and modernity, co-organized this event with co-sponsors, namely the Notre Dame Initiative on Race and Resilience and the Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies. As a co-director of the Contending Modernities initiative, I am so grateful for the many people working behind the scenes to make this event happen, despite considerable challenges. I will name only a few: Dania Strongham, Kate Chester, Jenna O'Brien, Erin Corcoran, Ari Woodworth, Asher Kaufman, Josh Lupo, Mark Sanders, and Dean Scott Appleby. My colleague, Mirza Family Professor of Islamic Thought and Muslim Societies, Ebrahim Moosa, will momentarily offer a more substantial introduction to Reverend Boesak. My job is different. It is to introduce the event itself and contextualize it. Let us begin by observing a moment of silence for all Israelis and Palestinians killed during this atrocious moment in our history. Let us meditate on the New York Times piece just today, headline, "War and illness could kill 85,000 Gazans in 6 months." Let us reflect on this for a moment. My name is Atalia Omer. I'm a religion, conflict, and peace studies professor at the Kroc Institute, one of the units comprising the Keough School of Global Affairs. My research has focused on religion, violence, and peace-building praxis, with a particular focus on Palestine, Israel. As I read through Reverend Boesak's biography, I found 2 points of connection between his participation in the struggles against South African apartheid and the realities in Palestine, Israel, that I am grappling with as a scholar of this case and as an Israeli Jewish person. The first point revolves around interrogating how religion becomes racialized and a tool for ideological oppression and domination. B'Tselem, a Jewish Israeli human rights organization, and other highly respectable human rights organizations such as Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International determined in recent years what Palestinians had said for many years prior, that the comparative legal category apartheid diagnoses the realities in Palestine, Israel, from the River Jordan to the Mediterranean Sea effectively. Albeit, apartheid operates differently across various fragmented geographies of Palestinians, Palestinian citizens of Israel within the boundaries of 1948, or the Green Line as it's called, Palestinians in the West Bank, where they are subjected to an intricate regime of identification cards and checkpoints, Palestinians in occupied East Jerusalem carrying yet another identification card, Palestinian refugees from 1948, some in the West Bank, and Gaza, which had been under blockade for 16, 17 years before becoming subjected to what the International Court of Justice rendered plausible genocide a few weeks ago. Such fragmentation is an outcome of policies and designs now, as we speak, designs that are being interrogated in the ICJ as a case distinct from the genocide case that was ruled on a few weeks ago. These policies and designs represent a form of racialized religious oppression, and B'Tselem, the Jewish Israeli human rights organization, uses the concept of Jewish supremacy to describe the logic of apartheid in each of those Palestinian geographies that I listed a moment ago. The second connection connection point with Reverend Boesak's move during apartheid mobilization beyond interrogating religions linked to the racialized structures of violence is the focus on religion as a vocabulary for emancipatory strength and solidarity praxis. It concerns how and why struggles for justice require building broad intersectional coalitions, including interfaith actions and internal or intra-faith contestations by connected critics who seek to emancipate people from the claws of the worst interpretations of their traditions, if those inform entitlements to violence and to dominate others. Suppose religion is deployed to sacralize violence and sanction structures of oppression. In that case, it needs to be contested and challenged hermeneutically, which means from within the sources of the tradition itself, and through an ethics of relationality. On this specific question, I want to highlight one forthcoming event Contending Modernities is organizing for March 4th. It will feature Michael Manekin, a leader of a nascent Jewish Israeli movement called the Faithful Left. Manekin is a religious anti-occupation Jewish Israeli activist. He will discuss his new book, End of Days, Ethics, Tradition, and Power. I will moderate a conversation between Michael Manekin and Rabbi Brent Rosen, who is based in Chicago and is the rabbi of a synagogue that defines itself as anti-Zionist yet deeply Jewish. This conversation aims to illuminate the internal contestations and divergent views regarding the relationship between Judaism, Zionism, and Israeli policies. University campuses are optimal places for such contestations and discussions that allow for questioning status quo, enforcing talking points and scripted narratives. In the conversation we will host on March 4th between Manekin and Rabbi Rosen, you will see strong critiques of the Israeli assault on Gaza and the entrenched structures of the occupation, informed by their understanding of Judaism. We will also see divergences between these two Jewish interlocutors. Those divergences are partly related to their distinct positionalities. One is rooted in the Israeli context and in many respects is still operative within a Zionist frame. The other is rooted in Chicago, and his conception of Judaism is diasporic. For Rosen, like in the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa, making apartheid nicer or reformed in one way or another was not an option. It needed to be dismantled, full stop. One thing about the relationship between these struggles resonates with me strongly. I remember hearing a conversation between Cornel West and Jim Wallis, who is an American theologian and editor of Sojourner magazine. I was then a graduate student. Wallis was telling a story about when Desmond Tutu, in a protest, invited a white police officer to come and join the struggle, to join the winning side. The invitation conveyed a critical point about the distinction between the structures and ideologies that oppress and dehumanize the individual people who can disrupt the scripts they were born into and join the winning side, the side of justice. The pivotal insight here is that violent ideologies such as apartheid dehumanize the oppressor as well as the oppressed. In my work, and specifically in my book, Days of Awe, Reimagining Jewishness in Solidarity with Palestinians, which is an ethnographic work, I have studied broad-based coalitions in the US formed around the question of Palestine. I show how people in the movement understand the interrelations between struggles against anti-racism in the US and Palestinian liberation, concluding that Zionism and anti-racism are inconsistent with one another. In the movement in the US, Jewish participation in the broader anti-racist movement that coalesced with Palestine solidarity requires a lot of cross-learning. Sometimes this means calling out an inadvertent deployment of anti-Semitic tropes. when discussing, for example, IDF, the Israeli military training of American police, resulting in the militarization of police forces in American cities, and the companies providing surveillance and walls in the Mexico-US borders. As well as in other sites, I trace a rigorous engagements with, for instance, James Baldwin's essay on how American Jews made a moral choice to become white. The point is to continue to deepen the relationship and learn to transform the matrices of violence that connect one liberation struggle to another. As a scholar of religion, ethics, and politics, focusing on Jewish politics, I add to the list of struggles the need to be liberated from an ideological formation that interprets Jewish safety as predicated on Palestinian unsafety. What shattered on October 7th was the illusion that Jewish safety could be maintained in perpetuity by keeping millions of Palestinians in a variety of cages or Bantustans. This concept from the South African case of apartheid is often used to describe the Palestinian map, where Palestinians are separated from Israelis so that the government of the latter may oppress the former. History did not start on October 7th. This year, we marked 75 years for the Nakba, which is how Palestinians refer to their catastrophe of 1948, when 750,000 people at least were driven out amid massacres and were not allowed to return, and 500 villages were destroyed by initially pre-state Israeli militias that then turned into the military. We mark 56 years of the military occupation of the West Bank and East Jerusalem, and 16 years of the siege on Gaza. It is important when we start telling the story. When I listen daily to the discourse in Israeli media about Gaza, I'm struck by an intense level of dehumanization of Palestinians and disregard for their lives. This is extremely painful. Beyond the utter destruction of roads, hospitals, schools, churches, mosques, museums, libraries, bakeries, and in unprecedented conditions of famine, we have reached the grim mark of 30,000 killed in Gaza since the aftermath of the horrendous murderous attack by Hamas on October 7th. As a Jewish person with roots in Europe, specifically in Germany, Czechoslovakia, Ukraine, and Poland, I am someone who carries on her soul the intergenerational trauma of the Holocaust. My friend Chaim, who was murdered on October 7th, was not murdered because he was Jewish, but because of the occupation and siege on Gaza. On March 5th, we will host a panel featuring Youssef Munayyer, who will address the weaponization of anti-Semitism as a part of Israeli public diplomacy, or hasbara, and how it detracts the conversation over and over again from a focus on territory to a focus on terrorism, also drawing on Islamophobic tropes, and from a focus on occupation to a discourse about self-defense. Munayyer heads the Palestine-Israel program at the Arab Center in Washington, D.C. In a conversation with Munayyer, a Palestinian American, by the way, we will have also a diverse panel from our faculty speaking on anti-Semitism and other forms of racism and hate. It is important to note that real anti-Semitism exists and that many people need to be educated on and unlearn anti-Semitic tropes. But it is important also to identify how and when an accusation of anti-Semitism is weaponized to silence and police critics, including Jewish critics of Israeli policies and Zionism, and also how it is weaponized to deny Palestinian lives and stories of displacement and belonging. I hope those of you here today will also attend our March 4th and March 5th events that will help further investigate those issues. So in my ethnographic work with American Jewish critics of Zionism and Palestine solidarity activists, I learned that the ancient Rabbi Hillel's profound, insightful questions capture what it means to be Jewish for Palestinian liberation. Rabbi Hillel, who lived during the first century of the Common Era, asked, If I'm not for myself, who will be for me? If I'm only for myself, who am I? If not now, when? That last question, if not now, when, became the name of one of the most prominent Jewish activist movements for ceasefire. Many Jewish activists have mobilized against the assault on Gaza with the cries, "Don't mobilize my grief, not in my name, never again to anyone. Jews will not be free until Palestinians are free." In other words, that capture two things. One, the lessons of the Holocaust cannot mean the displacement, domination, and erasure of another group of people that did not instigate the Shoah. If I'm only for myself, who am I? Second, struggles for liberation are interconnected. For the American Jews I studied in my book, Days of Awe, this conclusion was the upshot of a long process of what they termed unlearning, a particular narration of their identity as Jews that equated it with uncritical and unquestioning support of a political project called Israel. Rabbi Hillel's three questions and how they inform our moment of struggle connect to the lessons Allan Boesak brings from the South African struggle and its reliance on building broad interracial and interfaith coalitions to dismantle the structures of violence. Today's event seeks an understanding of what, speaking from the depth of the one case of South Africa, can illuminate about the other case of Palestine-Israel and the long history of Palestine-South Africa solidarity. Those links are deep. Every time I visit Ramallah with my Palestinian friends, I stop by the magnificent statue of Mandela sent by South Africa as a solidarity gift. It's giant, it's standing tall with a clenched fist. And when I stand by it, by the statue in Mandela Square, I remember that the response to the question, which side are you on, should be an easy one, even for me, a Jewish Israeli. And that I should join the right side of history, the drive for equality, dignity, and freedom for all, and dismantling systems that racialize and hierarchize humans. To join that kind of framing is an option open to all of us. To me, this is the value of today's event. And with this, I welcome Professor Moosa to introduce Reverend Boesak. Thank you.
Thank you, Atalia, for that wonderful framing of a very, very important conversation. How does one capture the work and impact of a theologian, a clergyman, and a political leader of the caliber of Reverend Dr. Allan Boesak in a few sentences? Well, by just telling the truth. Allan Aubrey Boesak was born in the town of Kakamas on the banks of the gorgeous Orange River in what is today South Africa's Northern Cape Province. After high school, he was educated at the University of the Western Cape and the Theological Seminary of the Dutch Reformed Mission Church, as the colored church was named at the time. At the age of 22, he became an ordained minister of the Word and Sacraments of the Dutch Reformed Mission Church in the town of Paarl, outside of Cape Town. Allan writes about how his mother raised them and struggled to make ends meet. His mother, who never finished elementary school, took on 3 jobs and went to extraordinary lengths in order to get them educated. The family produced 3 ministers and 5 teachers. In 1969, Dr. Allan Boesak received a scholarship to study at Kampen Theological Institute in the Netherlands, where he focused on ethics and political theology. The wellsprings of Dr. Boesak's theology were Black theology, which emerged from the Black consciousness movement pioneered in South Africa by Stephen Bantu Biko, who was murdered by the apartheid regime, but also South American liberation theology, the writings of the Peruvian liberation theologian Gustavo Gutierrez. And of course, the other major influences were John Calvin, Abraham Kuyper, and Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who was executed for resisting Nazi rule in Germany. All these currents fueled Boesak's theological apparatus. Among his interlocutors in the US were, among others, Nicholas Wolterstorff and James Cone. But Allan also drew extensively from the theology of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and from the work of Malcolm X. Dr. Boesak, in turn, formed his own account of the theology of prophetic resistance. Prophetic resistance not only made him express his dissatisfaction with the Dutch Reformed Church, but also it became his personal testimony. Prophetic resistance for Dr. Boesak is just not testimony, but also a witness for an alternative. This witness proclaims that both black and white, poor and rich, Arabs and Jews are all created after God's image, which allows for no discrimination and rejects subjugation, and about which we will very soon hear in great detail from our speaker. Returning to South Africa after his studies abroad, Dr. Boesak was the minister at the Dutch Reformed Mission Church in Belha, where he became more focused on the political situation to resist apartheid. Dr. Boesak was in the meanwhile elected as president of the World Alliance of Reformed Churches in 1982, a position he held until 1991. In that pivotal role, he relentlessly campaigned for justice and freedom in South Africa at an international level. It was also at the same time that he rose to prominence during the 1980s as a critic and an opponent of the National Party, the party that legislated racial segregation and settler colonialism called apartheid. Dr. Boesak played a preeminent role as a major, and when I say major, I mean major anti-apartheid activist alongside Archbishop Desmond Tutu. He became a patron of the United Democratic Front, the UDF, which is a very, very important movement from 1983 to 1991, and that the UDF transformed and emboldened the victims of apartheid to rise against their oppressors. During that time, he was continuously harassed and imprisoned by the apartheid police. Once negotiations began towards a transition in 1991, Boesak was also elected chairman of the Western Cape region of the African National Congress. Dr. Boesak has published over 20 books with more recent titles like Children of the Waters of Meribah, Black Liberation Theology, the Miriamic Tradition, and the Challenges of 21st Century Empire. Also notable is Kairos, Crisis and Global Apartheid, the Challenge to Prophetic Witness. In 2013, the Christian Theological Seminary and Butler University in Indianapolis appointed Dr. Boesak as the Desmond Tutu Professor for Peace, Global Justice, and Reconciliation Studies, a 4-year position he held jointly with both institutions. Soon after arriving in Indy, Allan was kind enough to invite me to Butler, where we connected again after many decades. It is an honor to host you at Notre Dame. In a small detour down memory lane, Allan, I want to recall our work together in South Africa, how along with hundreds, if not thousands of others, we were arrested when the mass democratic movement defied the state of emergency in March of 1989. On that day, the police, the military sprayed us with purple dye water cannon that came to be known as the Purple March in the heart of the city of Cape Town. And they held us until late at night, until lawyers freed us. Talking of resistance, our colleague Rashid Omar had already spent a month in apartheid jails during his years as a student activist, as a 17-year-old. And if it were not for good lawyering, he would have possibly gotten a 5-year sentence to Robben Island. We were unbowed by what apartheid did to us. And again, in September of the same year, 1989, the city of Cape Town saw some 70,000 people, if not more, in peaceful resistance to end apartheid in what was known as the last illegal protest in South Africa. And we were honored to be with you in that important event. Allan, you have been the embodiment of the tradition of truth-telling, prophetic boldness, and freedom of speech, which Michel Foucault in his work reminded us is called by the Greek term pariha. In your words, you showed how to break with the theology of accommodation to existing situations of oppression. For you rightly said, a theology of protest would never be enough, understanding that protest is always a form of begging and that only a theology of resistance could respond adequately to the call of costly discipleship. Drawing from our own struggle in South Africa and the words of the poet, the legendary Don Matera, who wrote the poem called Cry of Cain, resonates with the spirit of the prophetic theology against status quo theology, but also speaks to the moment and for the work that lies ahead. The cry of Cain. The cry of Cain is heard again. Cry of suffering, jab of pain. How it echoes ever deeper. Am I my brother's keeper? Must I fret or care when he calls a God who is not there? Go, my brothers, and wash your hands in the pool of indifference. But mind your silver crosses might pull you down, and it would be sad to see the self-righteous drown. Allan, we value your sacrifice and the work in systematically dismantling theological anthropology of racism. We learned from you about being unashamedly Black and reformed, how you embody the Bell Howell Confession, which I'm sure you will talk about today, that important witness and teaching that declared apartheid, legalized settler colonialism to be a sin. And in a post-apartheid democratic South Africa, you remain the voice of the voiceless, for the marginalized, for the excluded, caring passionately about human dignity, justice, and development, which are the themes that resonate with the mission of the University of Notre Dame, the Keough School, and all its institutes. I invite you, my friend, colleague, and comrade, to address us on the topic, Palestine, Israel, Lessons from South Africa. Friends, and all of you gathered here today, please help me to give a warm Notre Dame welcome to Dr. Reverend Allan Boesak.
Thank you very much, Ebrahim, my friend. Thank you, Rashid Omar, for mediating this return to Notre Dame. I'm so grateful to be with you. Dr. Scott Appleby and I have met for the first time, I don't know how many years ago, maybe 2015 or 16 or something like that. And I see much has changed in this town since then. I hope it's all for the good. It is a great privilege and pleasure to be here, and I greet you all, my friends, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. Back home, especially with Gaza occupying so much of our minds and our attention, I'm often asked by people from our own townships, why are you so insistent upon Gaza? Are you not forgetting our own struggles that are not yet over? And I try to explain to them the connections between the struggle in Palestine and the struggle in South Africa, and I remind them of the fact that these struggles are global struggles and that the bonds are global because it is all about saving the soul of humanity, whether it is at home in Khayelitsha or in Bonteheuwel or whether it is in Gaza. But I'm doing it also for another reason. In 1987, I was privileged to visit Lebanon, and that was the time when Al Shatia camp was still the largest refugee camp around. And at the end of our visit, they took us to the home of an elderly couple. And I will never forget that the woman who was our host that afternoon, we talked about the struggle and what she was doing there and how she had to flee from their home in Palestine and were now part of this exiled refugee community. And she walked to the wall, and there was this kiss that our people used to have, even in South Africa, opened it, where all the treasures were kept, little cups and saucers and beautiful coffee kettle. And she made us some coffee, and while we drank, she looked at me and she says, "Are you going back to your home?" I said, "Yes." And she said, "Promise me one thing." I said, "What is it?" "Please do not forget us. Remember what you saw here in these days." So that's the other reason I am here. I'm trying to keep that promise. And that's what I tell my people too. So every time right-minded Black South Africans have the opportunity to visit Israel, Palestine, they come away with a profound sense of shock. And it is the shock of recognition of profound disorientation. It is the shock of relived trauma. This is apartheid, we understand almost immediately. It is the sense that something as irrelevant as the color of one's skin or what is called racial identity has condemned you from the day of your birth. It is the onslaught upon your dignity through discrimination, through 1,000 humiliations every day and in every imaginable situation, and the relentless, deliberate process of dehumanization. It is the sense not only that your very life is being threatened at every turn, but in the eyes of those holding you in subjection, your life is utterly worthless. It is the ongoing tragedies of dispossession through theft of land and forced removals, destruction of property, and devastation of communities legalized and legitimized by what they call the law, enforced by the violence of their state. It is the myriad ways in which one is told that one has no place in the country of one's birth. It is the shamelessness with which it occurs, and it is always the violence, systemic, structural, physical, pervasive, and in a perpetual spiral of viciousness. And at its heart, unspeakably destructive and ultimately self-destructive though it may be, is the force that gives it all meaning, namely exceptionalism. Since 1948, South Africa, with its draconian, racist, white supremacist and exclusivist policies, had set the world a particularly vicious model of oppression and discrimination, injustice and exploitation. They called that system apartheid, and so much had that system impacted the world that we may speak today of a phenomenon called global apartheid, which includes socioeconomic inequalities and relentless exploitation, political and social exclusion, racial and ethnic discrimination, as well as gender injustice and heteronormative oppression. The common element there is not always the dominance of the racial element as the systemic, violent, pervasive, and totalitarian nature of that oppression. And again, it is driven by an unshakable sense of exceptionalism. The general reference globally today is the division of the world between the so-called 1% and the 99%, made crystal clear in so many reports and studies, of whom Oxfam's annual reports I find the most accessible. In January 2017, Oxfam reported that just 8 white men own as much wealth as half the world's population. 1 in 9 people do not have enough to eat, and more than 1 billion people live on less than $1.25 a day in 2020. Oxfam reported that in 2018, billionaires' fortune grew by 2.5 billion a day, while the 3.8 billion of the poorest half of humanity saw their wealth decline by more than 11%. In 2022, Oxfam told us this: as poverty levels increased to record levels and workers struggled with decades-high prices, 2/3 of the world's countries failed to raise their minimum wages in line with economic growth. Despite huge pressure on government finances, 143 out of 161 countries froze their raise on the richest citizens, and 11 countries even lowered them. The situation today is, of course, much worse than 2-3 years ago. Global apartheid is not only real, it is growing. And the greatest victims are always the poor, the powerless, and the marginalized, especially the women and the children. The description of Human Rights Watch is frighteningly recognizable when it describes India's treatment of the Dalits as, quote, hidden apartheid, unquote. Discrimination, denial of access to land, forced labor, degrading living and working conditions, abuse at the hands of police and higher caste groups that enjoy the state's protection. And here too is that ever-present element of exceptionalism in the caste system. And so in the last few years, emboldened by an aggressive state-sanctioned Hindu nationalism, it has been much more blatant, much more openly violent, and much more shameless. The term global apartheid expresses our understanding that apartheid is a system of governance expressed in politics and in actions that may occur anywhere and under different circumstances. In recent years, since the outbreak of COVID-19, the disparities as a result of socioeconomic inequalities, one of the most glaring forms of global apartheid, and the disproportionate suffering of the poor, the marginalized, and the people of color across the world, evidenced how powerfully relevant the term has actually become. The coronavirus has itself destroyed the myth that the pandemic was the great equalizer. It's not only exposed the criminal inequalities in healthcare, it has exposed all the entrenched, structural, institutionalized, and systemic economic, social, and political inequalities, and the incessant, comprehensive war against the poor and the vulnerable globally and nationally. Whether one is talking about people of color in the US, the UK, in Europe, or Native Americans or Native Canadians, or natives in Bolivia, Brazil, or the people of Africa, the racial element in all this nationally and globally is undeniable. Experts say that poverty and hunger, diseases and violence exacerbated by this pandemic will, including gender-based violence, may dwarf the number of those dying of the virus itself. And all this flies in the face of calls of solidarity by world organizations, and Oxfam calls it a care crisis. The WHO calls it a moral and political crisis, and 30 years ago, German theologian Jürgen Moltmann spoke of a God crisis. That description seems to be more relevant now than ever. For our specific purposes today, a more particular and painfully precise example of the way in which apartheid is applied, globally understood, and more readily perceived is in the policies of the modern state of Israel toward the people of occupied Palestine. And from its apartheid wall to its policies of incarceration, to land theft, to outright genocide, as we speak, Israel is rightly called an apartheid state. The application of the term to the state of Israel has upset many, and many Zionists of all stripes, Jewish, Christian, and irreligious, especially since the term has been recently so deliberately embraced and applied to the Israeli state by world bodies, including the United Nations and no less than 5 international human rights organizations, of whom we all know now. But in the struggle against apartheid, the church has taken a very strong and principled stance against racism as the central tenet of the belief of the church that all human beings are created in the image of God. But our understanding of these matters gradually deepened. We came to understand, in contrast to earlier times, that with regard to racism, we could no longer speak of it simply in individual, personal, that is to say, attitudinal terms. We understood racism in its historical, structural, and systemic dimensions and manifestations as well. And we saw the racism applied in South Africa as part of a larger imperialist and colonialist project. Racism, as we discovered, is all the more devastating when it is linked with power and powerlessness. And dealing with racism means dealing with power relations, with systems of domination, subjection, and exploitation. For us, human dignity is not just political or social economic concept. It expresses the wholeness of the worthiness of our human beingness. The church began to speak of racism as a sin because it denies the human beingness of others. It denies the truth that all human beings are created in the image of God, people whose humanity is confirmed and made sacred by the incarnation of God through Jesus Christ. We are human in the likeness of God, which means not a physical likeness, but our unique, dynamic relation to God, and hence to one another. But the father of the Reformation strain that I belong to, John Calvin, expressed it even stronger. John Calvin writes that when God looks at us, God's created children, it is as if God is looking in a mirror. In seeing us, God sees God's self. Now that is as close to an affirmation of the divine in us that Calvin ever came. Hence his conclusion that therefore any person, whoever and wherever they may be, and what they may be, is our brother and sister simply because they are human. The African way of life called Ubuntu teaches us that our humanity is confirmed by and in the humanity of the other. That our humanness is affirmed by our recognition of the humanness of the other. And therefore our existence is incomplete without that human recognition and reflection and our God-given capacity for intimate, caring, and loving relationships. Cultural, racial, ethnic, language, sexual, or any other difference cannot invalidate that basic truth that constitutes our human life together. In Jesus Christ, these truths become utterly compelling. It is for this reason that Black liberation theology has embraced so warmly also Paulo Freire's notion that it is the historic obligation of the oppressed to work for the liberation and the humanization of the oppressor. In 1986, in the midst of the darkest times of our struggle against apartheid, my denomination adopted a new confession that we call the Confession of Belhar. The main pillars of the confession are our unity in Christ, and so with humanity, the reconciliation wrought by Christ, and the justice demanded by God. Those three things. At the heart of the confession is what we confess about God. I quote, "We believe," the confession says, "that God has revealed God's self as the one who wishes to bring justice and true peace on earth. That in a world full of injustice and enmity, God is in a special way the God of the destitute, the poor, and the wronged, and that God calls the church to follow God in this. That God brings justice to the oppressed, gives bread to the hungry, that God frees the prisoners and restores sight to the blind, that God is the savior of the downtrodden, the protector of the strangers, the help of orphans and widows, the one who blocks the path of the ungodly. That the church must therefore stand by people in any form of suffering and need, and that the church must witness against and strive against any form of injustice, so that justice may roll down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream. And that the church, as the possession of God, should stand where God stands, namely against injustice and with the wronged. It is clear that the confession of Belhar has also learned much from Dietrich Bonhoeffer, especially this. "We have for once learned," he wrote, "to see the great events of history from below, from the perspective of the outcast, the suspects, the maltreated, the powerless, the oppressed, the reviled, in short, from the perspective of those who suffer." That is how we see through the eyes of Jesus, Bonhoeffer says. And he says this: "You outcast, you disadvantaged, you who are looked down upon, blessed are you, Lazaruses of all ages, you broken down and ruined, you lonely and abandoned, those who suffer injustice, you who suffer in body and soul, blessed are you. For God's joy will come over you and be over your head forever." That is the gospel. It is the good news, Bonhoeffer writes. From below, he would continue to make clear that to see through the eyes of Jesus and act as Jesus did. So in my view, there is no doubt where Bonhoeffer would be standing were he alive today. Succinctly put, Belhar confesses God's radical, indivisible justice, God's radical, indivisible equality, God's radical, indivisible inclusivity, and God's radical, indivisible solidarity. And so while Belhar came into being in the context of apartheid South Africa, the confession itself rises above and reaches far beyond racism and South African apartheid. That context has now become the global context. The church went further. We also called racism a form of idolatry, in which one dominant group assumes for itself, on the basis of pigmentation and the mythical belief in a social construct called race, a status higher than the other, and through political, cultural, military, and economic power, as well as socio-economic and psychological structuring, seeks to play God in the lives of the other. While white culture and white power demand from blacks a correction of their deviant, that is their black humanity, that is in fact God-given, it is to be celebrated, not denigrated. It is to be embraced, not discriminated against. It is to be dignified with love, not vilified by ignorance and abuse. Black people cannot correct their blackness in order to please white supremacists, just as Palestinians cannot correct their being Palestinian in order to please Zionists. The international community declared South Africa's apartheid, the spawn of Western imperialism and colonialism, a crime against humanity. The churches and the ecumenical movement, led by the World Communion of Reformed Churches, then the World Alliance of Reformed Churches, declared it a sin and its theological justification a travesty of the gospel and a heresy, still one of the Reformed Communion's finest and most prophetic moments in my view. But remember that sense of shock I spoke about in the beginning. That is reinforced by one other overwhelming reality, namely the disturbingly many ways in which Israeli apartheid is so much worse than South African apartheid. There is, of course, the extent of spatial apartheid. We still have the separation of space in the permanency of the black townships and the resultant inequalities of service delivery, education, and opportunities in life. We had, of course, the attempt at the creation of a fictional white South Africa with its sham independent Bantustans as homelands. But we never knew apartheid roads, for instance, especially built for whites, upon which black people were not even allowed to drive. South African land theft on a grand scale, and that issue is still far from settled, but even that is surpassed by the land theft exercised by the Israeli state. We had racial group areas, but apartheid never attempted to build a physical separation wall as we see in Israel and Palestine. Apartheid had the hated pass laws, and any police officer had the right and the power to stop a black person anywhere who had to show that pass. But the severity and level of cruelty at the Israeli checkpoints and the atrocities committed or allowed to happen there on a daily basis almost are quite unique. The inherent systemic and structural psychological violence of the apartheid system that leaves its victims permanently scarred and traumatized is a given and a subject all by itself. And in my view, we have not in South Africa paid enough attention to what that generational trauma might mean for us today, psychologically or theologically. But let us for a moment consider the level and degree of physical violence as an example. We have been imprisoned in South Africa in prisons on Robben Island. Torture in apartheid prisons were normal. We were subjected to hideous chemical and psychological experiments. But all of that is true for what we see in the Israeli apartheid state. However, the violence inflicted upon Palestinians today virtually is unprecedented. Destroying our ancestral homes is one thing, but targeted Israeli bombs destroying the homes and lives of Palestinians in ways black people have not seen, as is happening in Gaza, that is completely new to us. The way in which the army, snipers, targets deliberately youth with only stones and catapults in their hands, protesters in wheelchairs, medical personnel attending to the wounded, journalists trying to tell the truth about it all. And one has no words for what is happening today to babies in incubators. Since the advent of imperialist invasions and colonialism, we had experienced the genocide of the San and the Khoi people, my ancestors. We had endured the massacre of our people, from the Shirkui massacre in 1775 with 150 and more dead, the massacre at Bulhoek in 1921, to the Sharpeville massacre in 1960. The massacre at Langa Township in the Eastern Cape in 1985, where Archbishop Tutu and I presided at the funeral. The 1980s, with its unprecedented internal opposition and the two declared states of emergency, akin to military law, its hundreds of deaths over that decade are rightly described as the darkest period of the resistance to apartheid. So black South Africans are familiar with violence being inflicted upon us. Truth be told, however, Black South Africa under apartheid has not ever experienced the kind of terrorism and sustained war that is being waged against the Palestinian people on a daily basis now, hour after hour, unfolding before our very eyes is growing certainly. The extirpation of the Palestinian communities has its ultimate goal, the annihilation of the Palestinian people in one way or another, whether it's by land or in their identity. It's the perfection of a ruthless, well-designed, internationally backed settler colonialist project. South Africans have seen terrible violence, certainly, but we have not seen a phenomenon such as in Gaza, rightly described as the world's largest open-air concentration camp. I'm talking about human dignity. The other day, journalist Jeremy Scahill quoted a human rights report, and he said that there were, at that point, just 2 weeks or so ago, 2 toilets in Gaza for every 483 people. Talk about human dignity. Now this, I have seen in the Bantustans. That I have noticed. 1 tap for 900 families, that we still have. Because the liberation movement that became our government has given us an extension of apartheid that we have not fought for. But we have seen all the effects of what it means when electricity and water is being cut off, what that means for 1 or 2 of the hospitals still operational. This plus the 4 wars in 13 years, and now the genocide unleashed upon the Gazans, make the Palestinians of the Gaza Strip the most cruelly subjected people on earth. The South African apartheid regime was immensely cruel, but such undisguised genocidal mercilessness was not part of their policies. Seems to me that we can conclude South African settler colonialists were more intent on domination and exploitation. However, Israeli settler colonialism is intent on extermination. Annihilation is their intent, mercilessness is their method, impunity is their body armor. There is still, however, the far most glaring difference between the situations in Palestine and South Africa. And that is the aspect of international and ecumenical compassion and solidarity. In South Africa, from its formal inception in 1948, apartheid was allowed by the international community, led by the countries of the West, to run amok until about 1960. Then, for the first time, the world became more aware of what was happening in South Africa, and especially since 1976 and the revolution of the children. But it is now more than 70 years since the Nakba, and at least in official government circles, Palestinians, their plight, their unearned suffering, their subjection, and the cruelties that they must suffer, their right to freedom and dignity, do not even seem to exist for the governments of the West. The world sees, the world knows, the world participates in myriad ways, and the world remains unmoved. And this is the most egregious difference between our struggle and the Palestinian struggle for freedom and justice until now. As Archbishop Tutu and I traveled the world pushing this campaign against apartheid, we saw the growth and effectiveness of worldwide anti-apartheid sentiment, especially here in the United States, and in many cases, like in Germany, it was the women in waves of solidarity and commitment that opened the way for pressure on the South African government. We even saw that when the United States had its anti-apartheid legislation pushed through Congress, Mr. Reagan, then on the throne, had vetoed it. And in a much miraculous way, a bipartisan Senate overturned that veto. I was told then in 1986 that it was the first time in a foreign affairs matter that a presidential veto was actually overturned. God sometimes moves in the most unlikely places. But it remains my conviction that if we did not have this international solidarity and the international campaign of boycott and divestment and sanctions, that the South African struggle would not have come to an end in the way that it did, and as soon as it did. The churches of the world came to our aid in ways that had to this day set the standard for ecumenical solidarity and Christian love and faith and in action. Palestinians, for decades, had no such support until now. Now the streets of every capital in the Western world are flooded with people standing up against the occupation and against the genocide. And by their sides are hundreds and thousands of Jews uttering that powerful cry, "Not in my name." In South Africa, we are privileged almost every Friday to have a Shabbat meal with Jews for a free Palestine in South Africa at one mosque or another every Friday. It's one of the most amazing experiences in my life as long as I had been in the struggle for the last 45 years. It seems that the cry, "How long?" that Palestinians have been uttering for so long, is at last being answered. And it's been answered by those who have the integrity and the right to speak more than anybody else. I can't tell you what it did to my soul when I saw the flashes on my screen of my laptop of those 300,000 Jewish brothers and sisters blocking up the streets of New York City, blocking up Central Station, what is it called, at peak hour. That's activism. That's real. If you've got to mess them up where it hurts. So they understand that. But that makes it unnecessary for me to explain to my people that being a Jew does not equate with being Zionist. It makes it unnecessary for my people to come and understand and say, this is the difference between Mr. Netanyahu and Anthony here that you see every Friday. Omar knows him as he speaks at the mosque. We were there together for a Shabbos meal at Claremont Mosque. And that makes all the difference in the world. So where do we go from here? The black church in this country has been very hesitant on this Palestinian question. But in the last few weeks, we have seen a letter written to Mr. Biden, signed by 1,000 black preachers of all denominations. Just the other day, there's another letter written by the Council of Bishops of the AME Church, again with Mr. Biden as the subject, calling every evil by its name. They are not afraid to call a genocide a genocide. They are not afraid to say to Mr. Biden, we are speaking to you as the Church of Jesus Christ. You had better stop the complicity of this country in the shedding of blood of Palestinian children. Stop all military aid right now. Call for that ceasefire. You know that you can pick up that phone as Mr. Reagan once did and stop the war. And the reasons why you cannot do has not just to do with politics or with economics or what you think is on the other side of the Gazan border, on the other side of the war where the oil and the gas reserves are. But it has to do with your soul, and it has to do with the soul of this nation. That's how the church should speak. So where do we go from here? The situation is grim, no doubt, but I do not believe that all is lost. Not just because of what we have seen, in the past few months how people flood the streets in solidarity with Palestine in a new and very encouraging way. We also see that the reactions to what people do for Palestine on campus, on university campuses, in the states where new laws are being enacted just about every second week, people dare not say BDS, people dare not stand up for Palestine, otherwise they will be hauled before disciplinary committees, they lose their jobs, all of that. I think that these are signs of a growing sense of panic and powerlessness. They know that they are losing this battle. They know that they cannot win. They know that they cannot build a future on lies and the denial of the truth. They know that they must tell Israel, you have no future if you build your future on the blood of children. All of that are signs of a new way. They need to understand that the issue is not just Gaza, the issue is not just the ongoing Nakba, the issue is not even the meaningless debates about regime change in the Knesset. The issues are the occupation, the stolen land, the unfettered citizenship of all people, and an apartheid state that has made peaceful coexistence impossible. The issues are the right of return, the issues are human rights, the issues are dignity for Palestinian people and everybody else, security for all, and the creation of a non-racial, secular, inclusive, and truly democratic state. Let me return to the confession as I conclude. The confession says that the church is the possession of God. Jesus Christ is Lord. What does that mean? It means that God, the God of Jesus of Nazareth, not the false God that blesses slavery and apartheid and genocide and oppression. That God is a God of justice, and that God calls the church, that is those of us who call upon the name of Jesus and seek to follow Jesus as disciples, to follow God in this. And that the church must therefore stand by people in any form of suffering and need. No excuses, no exceptions, no compromises. Which means that the church must witness against any form of injustice so that justice may roll down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream. And that the church as the possession of God, not the possession of the privileged and the powerful, of the strong and the loud mouth, or the arrogant and the bigoted, the cowardly and the indifferent. That church should stand where God stands, namely against injustice and with the wrong. And if we truly believe this, if we truly enact it, the angels in heaven will rejoice in our faithfulness, and this world will be a different place. And so, yeah, that is my hope. And to return to Bonhoeffer, who, when he was put in a prison from where he would not be taken out alive, even as the bombs were falling just outside of Berlin, wrote this: "There are people," Bonhoeffer said, "who regard it as frivolous and some who think it impious for anyone to hope and prepare for a better future. They think that the meaning of present events is only chaos and disorder and catastrophe, and in resignation or pious escapism, they surrender all responsibility for reconstruction and for future generations. It may be that the day of judgment will dawn tomorrow. In that case, we shall gladly stop working for a better future, but not before." Thank you. God bless you.
Thank you, Dr. Boesak, for that wonderful insightful speech. It's now my honor to call upon my colleague, Imam Dr. Rashid Omar, Teaching Associate Professor at the University of Notre Dame, to deliver a few remarks, and there will be time for question and answers. Thank you very much. Imam Rashid.
Thank you, Dr. Boesak, for your insightful and challenging lecture. Your thoughtful reflections once again demonstrates and confirms that you embody and exemplify what Black Kairos theologians in the anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa called prophetic theology, witnessing for justice by speaking truth to power. I would like to just identify 3 critical lessons that peace practitioners and social justice activists in the United States and across the world can learn from the Palestine solidarity movement back in South Africa. And I can testify to the fact that you, Dr. Boesak, as I've said, you embody and exemplify all of these 3 lessons. The first lesson is that people, especially in the global South, were inspired by the South African government's courageous stance in taking the State of Israel to the International Court of Justice for accountability. But Dr. Boesak, you and I and our compatriots, we know that this bold and courageous move by our South African government was not prompted by a cabinet decision on its own. Rather, the South African government's intervention at the ICJ was largely in response to the unprecedented South African Palestine solidarity movement that has emerged and that is burgeoning at the grassroots level and at the civil society level across our country. And it has been led and guided by leaders such as you, Dr. Boesak, and others. Truly inspirational was the mass support and the passion the South African solidarity movement elicited for the liberation of Palestinians from settler colonial occupation of the past 4 months. The protest mood, as you have described, not only across our country, but in fact across the world, it is reminiscent of what we witnessed at the height of the South African anti-apartheid struggle during the 1980s. And it has given us renewed hope. The lesson from South Africa is crystal clear, that community-based activism and grassroots movements, they do matter. And they have the power to move intransigent governments despite the odds. The second critical lesson that has emerged from the current South African civil society movement in solidarity with oppressed Palestinians is that leaders such as Dr. Boesak are deliberately and consciously, as you heard him say right at the beginning of his lecture, making links and consciously channeling, strategically channeling the vibrant energies of this powerful grassroots civil society solidarity movement to re-energize and to sustain the myriad of local struggles South Africans have had to face after 3 decades of living in a post-apartheid South Africa. One such struggle is against the endemic crime and gang violence, which is crushing wholesome community life in marginalized communities in the city of Cape Town and elsewhere in our country. And so in a modest attempt to link our local struggles with that of our solidarity with Palestinians, some leaders like Dr. Boesak are creatively linking the call for a ceasefire in Gaza to a call for a ceasefire in the gang wars in marginalized communities in the city of Cape Town to end the cycles of crime and violence experienced daily in these communities. This is another critical lesson for all solidarity movements across the world. Our current solidarity with the suffering people of Gaza and oppressed and occupied people of Palestine should be consciously used to strengthen our own local grassroots and civil society struggles for peace with justice in our own home communities. Here at the University of Notre Dame's Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies, we call this intersectionality, meaning all forms of oppression are interconnected, and therefore all struggles for justice need to be aligned and in solidarity with each other. Finally, a third lesson from South Africa is the strong and robust leadership role played by Reverend Dr. Boesak and other Christian theologians and leaders within the Palestine Solidarity Movement. For this helps to counter the false narrative that seeks to frame the anti-colonial struggle of Palestinians into a religious conflict between Muslims and Jews. In this regard, as you have mentioned in your lecture, it has been truly inspirational in South Africa to attend those weekly Friday evening Shabbos for Gaza services, called by a group naming itself South African Jews for a Free Palestine. The Shabbos is usually convened at the Sea Point Beach Promenade and supported by people of all faiths and of none. We hosted, as you said, one of those Shabbos services at our mosque in Cape Town. And you, Dr. Boesak, you spoke at another. The critical point being that the struggle of Palestinians is a struggle against occupation. It is a struggle against land theft and displacement, and not a religious struggle against Jews. Here again, the interfaith solidarity which we forged in the crucible of the anti-apartheid struggle in the 1980s and the 1990s, where people of all faiths and none stood side by side in the fight against apartheid, has stood us in good stead. I want to conclude with the challenging words of a rising star in Palestine, a Lutheran pastor of Bethlehem, Reverend Dr. Mundir Isaac, who constantly reminds us, and he reminded us just last week in the streets of London, that Gaza is the moral compass of the world today. Thank you again, Dr. Boesak, for your discerning lecture and for hopefully stirring up and evoking our moral compass. Thank you for your long-standing Christian witness for a more compassionate and a just world. I salute you, my elder brother, with a powerful anti-apartheid slogan that was our source of solace and inspiration during the hard and difficult days of the anti-apartheid struggle. Amandla, Awetu, power to the people.
Power to the people. You have an opportunity to ask questions to especially Dr. Boesak or to Imam Rashid. Feel free, there are microphones roaming around. Just put up your hands and you'll be able to take one from this side and one from that side. Okay. Yes, please.
Thank you very much for a very powerful presentation. I also use the apartheid model in my classes to teach about the conflict. but I also problematizes it by bringing in a nationalism. And it's a word that you did not mention, I think, even once in your presentation. I mean, the way I see the conflict foundationally is a struggle between two national movements, and it has racial, racist elements. Israel is using apartheid systems of control that are clearly could be classified as apartheid. But there is a very strong national element to the conflict, which you did not address. I wonder if you can reflect on that with us.
You can go right from there. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for that question. I think that you are right about nationalism being a very powerful force. In that case, it's almost a manufactured nationalism that we are dealing with, is it not? It is a manufactured nationalism built on concepts and precepts that are not authentic or homegrown in that sense. We think of nationalism as a group that brings people together around a kind of ideology. Now, Zionism is that ideology. But does it have the power of a nationalist movement that can bring all people together? In South Africa, when we first talked about nationalism way back, I say we, the people who started this thinking in the beginning of the 20th century, 1910, 1912, saw themselves, the African National Congress, as a national movement. But it was a national movement that they saw, for want of a better word, I hate this, but let's say Black Africans only. And until they learn that is a manufactured concept, that it is in a sense an exclusionary concept, and that the nationalism that we're looking for is a much wider thing that must bring people together. Then for the first time, it began to have meaning for all sorts of people in South Africa, bringing all, but it was not until the Black Consciousness Movement and the United Democratic Front that we really knew what it meant to stand together on that basis. So the nationalism that we fought was the nationalism of white supremacy, that they turned also into a nationalist thing that was not for real. And so I'm sure you thought much more about this, but I think where it is an element in that, it might, in my view, not be the driving force right now. I think it is a conglomeration of elements that are being brought together in a rather, as I say, manufactured way. And I don't know how long that can last, and that's why it may be crumbling the way it is crumbling right now, if I understood you correctly.
Thank you very much.
Another question?
Yeah, if people could also introduce themselves when they, that's Asher Kaufman, the director of the Kroc Institute, who just asked the first question.
Goeiedag, Pastor, or afternoon. I am Lehlonolo January. I am a master's student studying a master's in international human rights law at the law school here at Notre Dame. My question is around accountability. Seeing that South Africa has taken, a leading role with ensuring accountability in the international stage by taking Israel to the ICJ. My question is centered around accountability at home. When you consider how many South Africans have enlisted or are currently fighting on the side of the IDF, and there's been a lot of political chatter amongst a lot of the political leaders in South Africa about these individuals being prosecuted. And when you also consider how many schools in South Africa boast about having individuals enlisting to fight on behalf of the IDF after matriculating. A school in Cape Town went on TV and said that it was proud that 22% of its students enlisted to fight for the IDF. So my question is around not only ensuring accountability on the international stage, but seeing that accountability is also ensured domestically.
You are right, of course. Thank you for that question. Dr. Rashid Omar is correct in saying that South Africa's government would never have taken the case to the International Court of Justice had it not been for the persistent pressure that we had put on them I mean, when we had that first march of 10,000 people, I'm just talking Cape Town. I'm not even talking Joburg and Durban, all those other places. I'm talking Cape Town, 10,000 people contained in the area of Salt River and Woodstock. And then we had a march of almost 200,000 people in the whole of the city. And we had rally after rally after rally where we made our demands very, very clear. And if it were not for that, the South African government would never have taken that step. So that was in reaction to people's power. It was also in hopes of when they do that, then we would let go of the other demands. So we had other demands. And one of the demands was indeed that we close down the Israeli embassy, for instance. Now, my argument has always been South African government does not have the power of the Biden government. Cyril Ramaphosa cannot pick up the phone, as Mr. Biden can but won't, to tell Mr. Netanyahu stop the war. But we must do, was our argument, what is in our power. Even with going to the ICJ, my argument was consistent. See, it's almost as we're taking our power and we're giving it into the hand of those judges. And what they do with it is outside of what we can control. Do what we can control. In other words, BDS is something that we can control. Do that. Holding South African citizens to account to go and serve in the IDF. There are laws that we have that cover that. Why don't they do that? Making sure that South African ports are closed to Israeli ships or ships that trade with Israel. We can do that, but they won't. Part of the reason is that there are too many people around Cyril Ramaphosa, including himself and his family, who do business with Zionist Israel. And so their business dealings and their profits that they make are far more important than listening to what the will of the people are, or worrying about the decimation of the Palestinian people in Israel. So that is the kind of accountability that we are still pushing for. And so even though we are grateful that they did take this one step, we constantly remind them that this is not the end. You and I mean, I'm not very popular with Mr. Ramaphosa, but I keep on saying, and once the Minister for Foreign Affairs was sitting next to me, and I said to her on the public system in my speech, please remind the President that he is not the president of Zionist Israel, he's the president of South Africa, and he must listen to what our people are saying. So it's that kind of accountability that we are trying to instill. Cyril Ramaphosa on his own would never, ever, ever think of doing this. But it is the people who are pushing him to do this kind of thing. And so we are not done yet. This thing is not over, and we will not stop. Until all of the demands of the people, until we have made what is possible in our power to do. And so that remains on our agenda.
Thank you. As the moderator, I will extend the session for a couple of minutes because we went over. I have a question from Professor Atalia Omer, and I got a question at the back there. Yes?
Yeah, I actually, I think it's important to go back to the question posed by Professor Kaufman just a few minutes ago. And I don't know, maybe for a second I can put my teacher's hat, because I have many of my wonderful students here. Because, I mean, it's about the point of, okay, the use of the concept of apartheid, but we are able to operate with multiple explanatory frames concurrently and recognize their kind of realities as they intersect with one another. So we are able to think about, to understand and recognize nationalism as a real reality that is very, very powerful. And of course, it didn't land from the sky. It's produced, people are socialized, incubated into it, and so forth. We can also bring the framework of settler colonialism. We can also bring the framework of apartheid, of course, to describe the realities of violence and fragmentation of Palestinians. And we can bring the reality with all of its kind of sets of logics and rationalities of the military occupation. So this is just to kind of highlight the need for complex thinking about these issues. And to me, when I heard this notion of the manufacture, it made it sound not real, as if, and so what I'm grappling with and what I've been all my life really thinking about it, as I was told, you're a part of a Jewish state. And I'm like, well, what does it mean? What does it mean? So part of the kind of if one wants to think constructively about everyone who is inhabit the space, the kind of the operative notion is not to think about this as a manufacture, while there is a need to understand the colonial dimensions of it and how Zionism in and of itself is a form of also internalized anti-Semitism. And it is about, when I teach classes on Palestine and Israel, I said, this is also a class about Europe. So I don't want to, Europe is at the center, Europe is a project. And so kind of like for me to think constructively is to think about how to reimagine what it means to be Jewish in the space. And this is while dismantling the structures of violence. You can call it, let's call it apartheid. But it's not this, it's like, it kind of like a move from a binary construction, recognizing, okay, there are structures of violence that need to be dismantled. And at the same time, how can you think of being, if you, again, going back to Hillel's question, if I'm not for myself, who will be for me? If I'm only for myself, who am I? So I just wanted to highlight those tensions and see what you thought about that. Thank you.
Okay. No, I just think it's an interesting conversation to have. When I say manufactured, I do not mean that it is not real. And I certainly do not mean that it is not dangerous. I'm saying it's manufactured. That may make it even more dangerous. Because you do not have, as I hear you speak, a natural national affinity to what is happening in Israel right now. Certainly not to the government, certainly not to the ideology that they want to instill. Many young people do not see themselves at all connected to that. And so that kind of nationalism that grows from the ground up, that is organic, that makes you embrace everyone for a common goal, not a goal that alienates half the population, for instance. So that's what I mean. But it's probably something that we should have a little bit of a conversation about, because what that means. My take on what nationalism is, I'm not a very ardent nationalist, so that.
But that could be a conversation over dinner. I have two more assignments. One is to let the gentleman at the back ask his question. Then I have to call on my dean, because my salary and my job to give the vote of thanks, and I know that some people have to get to some appointments. But before all of you disperse, do remember what a special day this is for us here at Notre Dame. Dr. Allan Boesak, on the 23rd of February. Today is a significant day for two reasons. It's his birthday and also his anniversary. At the back, can you keep your questions short? And then, Scott, can you please come to us? No, he's going to ask a question, but that will give you time to get home. It takes me a long time to get home.
Yeah, first of all, happy birthday, Dr. Boesak, and
Thank
also
you.
happy anniversary.
Talk to my wife about the anniversary.
My name is Tim, and I'm a junior here studying at the University of Notre Dame. My question is kind of this post-apartheid kind of environment where we find ourselves in. We see that the ANC, the African National Congress, is actually, in fact, Ramaphosa actually stole millions of dollars from the government revenues and continues to kind of exploit the system that was left behind in apartheid to continue to fund his own wealth. And also we see that in the West Bank, we see the party Fatah, they are actually sometimes aligning with Israel, and they're incredibly corrupt too. And we see Hamas, their leaders are like in Lebanon, they're in Qatar, they're safe. while they're, the Palestinian people are actually being bombed and massacred. So I'm just like curious to see what's your take, and how can the people themselves keep their leaders accountable in South Africa and in Palestine? Thank you.
Thank you, Tim.
It's difficult to keep leaders accountable when they are in exile and the people on the ground. And that is why homegrown internal resistance is so important. And for that same reason, there was this gap, I won't say gulf, but a significant gap between the internal resistance led by the people and the in exile. And so to keep those leaders accountable, you need much more than just proximity. You need much more than just a kind of common ideology. You need a spiritual connection that the ANC had lost. I don't know. I think the people of Palestine do not think of their leaders and Hamas who have to be in Lebanon, for instance, for safety, or in Qatar, or wherever they are. I think they see the leadership of Hamas in Gaza, and that makes a difference. What's going to happen? The interesting question is, what's going to happen to that illegitimate body they call the Palestinian Authority, that Mr. Biden so very much want to be in power after all of this is over? And how, if the people can be insistent enough to say the leaders that we choose that will take us into the future. That's another link with South Africa that we didn't have time to explore. Take us into the future is not the leadership that you will choose for us, wherever they may come from, but the leadership that we will insist upon as the people decide. And that's going to be a different kettle of fish altogether.
Thank you, Reverend Dr. Boesak, for that. It's now my pleasure to ask Dean Scott Appleby to deliver the vote of thanks. Dean Appleby.
It does fall to me the happy pleasure of thanking Reverend Dr. Boesak for, among many other things he's given to us today, is an embodiment and expression of what we mean when we say that religion is a vast, internally plural tradition. A lot of contestation. Here we have a Christian voice who reaches deep into that tradition and interprets it in a way that drives home the truth at the heart of this tradition, in this case Christianity, namely that God is with the crucified, the tortured, the brokenhearted. And that retrieval of a vast and complicated tradition is what we've seen on display here to the cause of justice. I thank you for that, among other lessons you've taught us today. I'll also add this. For the students and really everyone here, if you've been listening carefully, and I know you have, you will remember one of the first sentences that Professor Omer voiced, how complex the situation is, how nuanced, how complicated, how historical. It would be foolish, and none of us, I think, believe that one session, however rich as this one has been, even begins to comprehend all the dimensions of it. But this has been a wonderful start and part of that conversation. What we try to do here at Notre Dame in the Keough School and more broadly is create enough events and spaces for students and faculty and distinguished guests to air all responsible views on whatever topic it may be. And you will see, you've seen already, you will see in the weeks and months ahead, there will be other opportunities within the Keough School, within the Kroc Institute, and in the broader university, because this is what a university does. It welcomes reasoned debate. It always rejects hate speech, but it's not shy from going deep into issues of justice, compassion, and mercy. And that's why I'm so pleased that you've been with us and that all of you have attended. Thank you so much.